everyone. Thanks for joining us again on the Reality 2.0 podcast. I am Katherine Druckman. Joining me today, as always, is Doc Searls, who you all know, or you should by now. We also have Petros Koutoupis, our frequent guest co-host. Petros is going to tell you his best title ever in just a moment, but in the meantime, we also have Dave Huseby, who is currently the security maven with Hyperledger, but he's also going to tell you his best title ever because they have some good ones. I don't think I can compete with it, quite frankly. And today we're gonna talk about a few things, probably a little Hyperledger, a little decentralized internet, and we're gonna have a good time. So with that, Petros, what is your best title ever? Job title?
Well, at a certain point, titles become somewhat meaningless, in the workforce. So a lot of companies allow you to make up your own, or they'll make one up for you. And when I was with IBM, it was Chief Necromancer and Troll Master. So whenever anybody looked me up in the internal company directory, that's exactly what you would find.
Oh, that's great. Can I just introduce you as that from now on when you do the podcast?
Chief Necromancer.
Excellent. Okay, and Dave, please tell us what your coolest title ever was.
Well, official title or nickname?
Both. Please, both.
Well, apparently my nickname, the best one I've ever been given, was when I worked at Mozilla. I was known as Dr. No because I was heavily involved in security and privacy there. And apparently I would just go into meetings and say, no, we can't collect data on users. We can't do this. No. And so they're like, great, Dr. No's here. We can't have any fun. And that's kind of followed me out into the broader world. I've heard people refer to me that at conferences. But I think also my best title ever was at Mozilla. I was officially their engineer of speculative and disruptive technology, which gave me a wide portfolio to stick my nose in a lot of places.
That's great. Somebody has to be the Dr. No, back to that. It's good that, somebody's got to do it. It might as well be you.
Yeah, guess.
So Doc, with that, you want to take it away and give us.
Yeah, I was actually saying things, but I put myself on mute.
Oh,
one of the many headstones I've thought of having is one that just says, "Sorry, I'm on mute." But anyway, I would just want to say that I had a business partner whose nickname was the Magic 8 Ball because you would go to him for a decision. He'd just give you one. And usually the answer was no, by the way. Anyway, and between Doc and Sleepy, which is my nickname in junior high school, I have been 2 of the 7 dwarves. So that covers something.
I've known you to be grumpy too.
I can be grumpy. It has happened. It has happened. And I am sneezy for sure, as I'm allergic to California. And that's part of my portfolio of characteristics. By the way, there's something about doing something like this that brings out the wood chippers in the city. It's not just the leaf blower people, but what you're hearing in the background. Fortunately, I have a very directional mic here, so hopefully it's
I hear nothing.
Helping. Yeah. Wow. It's really loud. I'm very impressed that this actually works. They're actually they're grinding up trees outside, like in the driveway.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, about Dave, I really wanted Dave on the podcast because he is among the purest people I know, and coming from the free software and open source side, and especially around personal freedom, which should be at the base of it's at the base of many of the world's great documents and principles and laws and the rest of it, but isn't, and I think was there kind of at the most basic level in the internet itself, like at the TCP/IP level. But he might even dispute that. But one of the things he talks about and has talked about is that the web itself, it has inequality built into it. For Linux Journal years ago, I wrote a piece saying, quit making cows and quit being calves, because I thought of client server as a calf-cow system. You're always the calf. You go to the cow for the milk of content and cookies you don't want. And And but later somebody told me that in fact, slave master was an early, that client server was a euphemism for slave master. And we could see it. We could see it in the way it's played out. So anyway, I was looking forward to Dave talking about that.
Yeah, well, I've just recently published a bunch of stuff, and I think that's what perpetrated, or what brought this conversation out. I've been thinking about this for a very, very, very long time. I think the reason why, you said earlier, a lot of the purists are no longer with us, and that I'm one of the few that remain. I think that's a historical consequence. I was first on the internet in the late 80s when I was 12. So, and I was always into math and codes, and I was involved in reading, well, not really involved. I wasn't writing software at the time, but I was definitely reading and understanding cryptography as it was being worked on in that time. And I really was marinated in that whole cypherpunk culture of maximum freedom and cryptography as a tool of sovereignty. And unfortunately, a lot of them were, what we euphemistically call graybeards back then. Even they were retired engineers from Bell Labs and things. And so, yeah, most of them aren't around anymore. But to get to your point about the World Wide Web, I don't know how many of your listeners have heard of this, but there's sort of a movement afoot about we call the D-Web, right? The decentralized web. And it's people
distributed.
Or a distributed web. Yeah, it's Tim Berners-Lee and, a lot of the former Mozilla people. And they're trying to put energy into tools that they think will re-decentralize the web or redistribute the web, right? And I'm making a bit of a reputation for myself by being the one person in the room that says that's a fantasy that was never true. The web itself was never decentralized, that it was baked in from the beginning. The seeds of our Facebook, Twitter, Google dominated world that we have today. And my number one piece of evidence for that is that the surveillance economy was pioneered by InfoSeek in 1994.
Really?
The web was barely 2 years old.
Yeah, I paid them for searches
right.
back in the beginning.
They pioneered the pay for advertisement per 1,000 impressions, that market. They also pioneered looking at what people search for and drawing market intelligence from that and selling the data. And that was back in 1994. Wow. Like literally the web was barely in existence, right? I think the summer of 93, I had a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper and I had every web server in the world written on it. That's how small the web was when the surveillance economy got started. So
did you use Lynx or one of the pre-graphical browsers?
No, I think my first browser was Mosaic. I think so. I mean, I did write some C code that could connect and download a page, so I could archive web pages. I remember doing that. But I was a Mosaic browser user. But hey, what were you saying?
No, I said like curl or wget is today.
Yeah, a primitive version of that, basically. But yeah, the problem with the web is that when it was invented, we didn't know, we just didn't know better. There are 9 fundamental problems that distributed systems have to solve, and the web only solves 2 of them. And my thesis in this line of thinking is that if you don't provide a solution for any of them, that you open up an opportunity for companies to come in and fill that void. And I call it corporate capture. And the best example of that is what GitHub did with Git. Git doesn't provide decentralized solutions for a lot of the functions that you need to have to use Git effectively. And so then GitHub comes in and provides those services and quickly captures a third of the market of open source developers, and then they get bought by Microsoft for billions of dollars. I mean, the web originally was designed to only just move files from a server to users and then to be able to bounce around servers, right? And it doesn't provide like most of the decentralized services. And so it's no surprise that almost immediately companies started filling in the gaps and building the surveillance economy and doing all the things. I guess my main criticism of the D-Web is that they're not trying to get away from the web. They're trying to quote unquote recreate a decentralized web, but I'm saying that that's a fantasy. It never existed. So if it never existed, how do you know you're achieving it, right? And if you're using these legacy technologies that don't have user sovereignty and user protections built into them, how are you ever expecting to build something that does have those properties if you're building it from constituent pieces that do not? And
so those properties, you said there were 9 or so, and
well, those are the problems of distributed systems. And to build a fully decentralized solution or decentralized system, you have to solve each of those problems with a decentralized solution. And I make a distinction between the word distributed and decentralized. Not all distributed systems are decentralized. Decentralization is more about the balance of power between users and the operators of the network and about user sovereignty. Like Facebook, for instance, is a distributed system. It's thousands and thousands of computers all over the world that work together to provide the service. That's distributed. But nobody would say it's a decentralized service because users have no sovereignty. You just have to submit to the rules of Facebook or don't use the service, right?
That's interesting because most of the, including my own writing on this, go back to Paul Barron, who said that he's the one who made the original distinction between. He basically brought it out, saying that that computing at that time was 1964, 62, somewhere back there, consisted of a few enough computers to name, and he said those are centralized, and then you can also decentralize them, and then. But he said the third level is distributed, and that's often credited with helping design the internet as it happened. But I think your point is that on the server side, that Facebook is is distributed,
right?
But
as
we're
a
not
system.
As a system. So what we want, in order to have full sovereignty for individuals, that is decentralization, not distribution. Where in
correct,
that case,
and I realize that I'm conflicting with previous definitions of these words, and unfortunately, now that we have decentralized identity or self-sovereign identity coming out of Hyperledger, those two words, distributed and decentralized, kind of got muddied together.
Yeah, they're very mushed together. Yeah,
right. True. And so I'm seeking to clarify the distinctions between the two of them, and that sets up the discussion of, well, if decentralization is about user sovereignty, well, what is user sovereignty? And I like to think of it as whatever Facebook isn't, whatever Twitter isn't. And when I started going down that road, I realized that there's roughly 6 principles of user sovereignty. And they're
lay
pretty
those
easy
out
to remember.
because those are,
so just think about how the web is now. The web is not user sovereign. So and if Facebook and Twitter and Google are one end of a spectrum that we're calling the user sovereignty spectrum, the end that doesn't have any user sovereignty, what does the opposite, the extreme other end of that spectrum look like? And when you think of it that way, these properties fall out pretty easily. The other end of the spectrum is that everything is private by default. Meaning that not even logging, right? You would assume that IP address logging doesn't exist. They never ask, for your username or anything like that. So it's all private by default, maximum private by default. At the same time, it would also be pseudonymous by default. And I use pseudonymous because anonymous means that there are no names. And on the internet, that's almost impossible. So pseudonymous is the equivalent of anonymous, except that you're using proxies for your identity, like your public key, for instance. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting that, anonymous literally means not
No.
nameful. Anonymous without an A at the front, which sounds like anonymous is actually to be nameless. But your point is, in order to interact, you're going to have a name. So you make one up.
Right.
It can be your real name or not.
Right. And you can call, and what we're really fighting against here is what's called correlation. And correlation is just a fancy word for tracking. Like, can I identify you as the same person I talked to 5 minutes ago? That's tracking, that's correlation. And if you're using things like public keys or large random numbers to identify yourself, you can constantly change them. So you can break correlation, right? So it's effectively anonymous, although you're giving some value, a number, like, okay, you don't need to know who I am, but I'm droid TK419, right? And now later on I'll be Princess Leia, and then later on I'll be Luke Skywalker. Like, I can constantly change my name.
Been doing in IRC since forever.
Exactly, you know? Right. That's a pseudonymous system.
I've been rumpled foreskin there for, off and on.
That's hilarious. So yeah, those are the first two: private by default and pseudonymous by default. So that gives you, like, as a user, you have a pretty big hammer. You have a lever, right? You have a lot of leverage over servers that are designed this way, because if the economy is one of surveillance and tracking you, which is largely how Google and Twitter and Facebook make their money. If you assume a system that is the opposite of that, now they have to come to you, and that gives you sort of a more balance of power in the system. So those are the first two, and then the next one is, this one's more like the Tor browser. The Tor network guys and ladies influenced me on this one. You want strong encryption by default. No packet leaves my system unencrypted, and so that the systems in the middle cannot see it at all, right? So communication must be endpoint to endpoint only, so end-to-end encryption. So that's the third one. The fourth one is one that you like, which is everything needs to be built using open and standard protocols and formats. And this one is about portability, data portability, user portability. I should be able to take my ball and go home, right? Imagine if Facebook, imagine if there was a standard. I know there was like a friend of a friend standard once or whatever, but imagine
back in the imagine
imagine if there was an actual internet standard for how to store your social graph and all your data. And if I went to Facebook and I said, I want to close my account down and I want all of my data in a standard format. And then if Mastodon had supported that standard format, I could then just go over, sign up to sdf.org and log into their Mastodon and then upload all my data from Facebook, right? This again maximizes my leverage as a user, my freedom as a user, my sovereignty. I can leave any service I want and go over to another one if all my data is in a standard format and protocol.
In economic terms, and also I think in terms of using multiple services, that's called substitutability. You can substitute one for another. I can like Lyft and Uber are substitutable if you want to use them, right? There, you can use either one. Everybody understands how they work. Yeah.
Right.
But your data is not. Your data, it's locked up in either one of those. You can't take one to the other.
Right. We do have a widely used system that is completely open in standard protocols and formats. People take this for granted, but email is this way. Yeah. Because I can write some Python or use a tool that talks IMAP, download all my emails and contacts and store them in a vCard file and an Mbox file. Then I can go and sign up with Fastmail and I can upload an Mbox file and upload a vCard, and I'm totally portable in my data.
I've done this 4 times at least so far.
I do have something to mention about email, and this is I cannot speak to every email host provider, but there are some companies out there. One that, for example, that rhymes with the word Yahoo. No, I'm kidding. It is that will literally store your email indefinitely for the rest of the time. They have every single email since they first went online stored on their storage servers in their data centers, And even if you shut down your account, that email will remain there forever.
Really?
Oh, that doesn't Google say unless that there's only last 18 months or something like that? They have some time limit.
This was part of a conversation that I had with a rep back when I used to work with the former.
It sounds credible. I mean, it's just because, given data hoarding imperatives.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So wait, can we go back and rounding out these 6 here?
Go for it. You got 2 to go.
Speed them up. So yeah. So just to recap, the first 4 are private by default, pseudonymous by default, strong encryption by default, and open in standard protocols and formats. Those are the first 4. Then the last 2. This one's more about what we're working on at Hyperledger and the whole self-sovereign identity. The 5th principle is what, not who, for authorization. So accounts on Facebook and Twitter and Google, you have to use your real name, and they go through all kinds of stuff to ensure that. You have to link it to a phone that has a billing address or whatever, right? I mean, I've tried to get around this a few times, and just to see how good it was. Like, I've bought SIM cards for $20 and put it in a phone and see if I could register with that. Apparently they know all of the telephone prefixes for all of these cash for only SIM cards. And they won't allow you to register on Twitter unless it's like an AT&T or a well-known real name validator, I guess, right? So the important thing about this is that a good friend of mine, Timothy, actually you know him, Timothy Ruff. He likes to say, "I don't care who you are. I just care that you're properly licensed and qualified to fly the plane."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't need to know your name or your kids or anything about you. As long as you are, have the pilot's license and you're healthy, then great. That's all I care about when I get on the airplane. So that speaks to this what, not who. It's about what you possess, what is true about you, not who you are. And this becomes really important when you're talking about transactions and you want to buy something. You don't need to know my name. You just need to know that I'm good for the money. And if it's online and you have to mail me something, I should just have to be able to prove that the FedEx or post office knows how to get something to me. You don't need to know who I am. Take my money, mail me my thing, and that's it. And the reason this is one end of that spectrum is because everything we have today is based around, give me your phone number, give me your email address, let me look at your ID that has all your personal information on it.
Give me more than I need.
Exactly.
And that has market value for me. I can hand it over to marketing and they can sell it or give it away.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And
then the last.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Go. No.
I was going to say the last one here is really sort of a meta idea, but it's a balance of power between users and the system. And this could be seen as tangential to what you're doing with customer comments, Doc, about there should be such a thing as user terms. So if I do choose to correlate myself, if I do choose to share my data with you as a system, I want to have a standard set of rules that the system itself has to follow when it's storing my data, that kind of thing. So
it is a sign of how much the web, at least as it's been built out, is centralized, that it's very hard for anybody to imagine even that an individual could have their own terms or could travel about the web with their own set of terms that others could agree to. And
this is also intent casting related as well. Yeah. Exactly.
So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go, Catherine.
Go ahead.
Well, I just, assuming we're finished with the 6, did I count that right?
Yeah, that's all of it. Wait, I had one last point I wanted to point out here.
Make your last point.
About the user sovereignty piece, right? I've heard people come to me and say, well, what about the GDPR and the CCPA? Like, isn't this a legislative solution to the problem you're trying to solve technologically? And I like to point out that this legislation has been written through a system, our democratic process, where the companies that we worry about, Facebook, Twitter, Google, whatever, have some influence on this. And so I would argue that the GDPR and CCPA are more like the Magna Carta in the sense that it's a détente between sort of these tech oligarchs.
The nobles and the king agree.
Right, exactly. And then what this analysis of the user sovereignty and the decentralization stuff is more like the American Declaration of Independence, which is a complete rejection of the aristocratic order. It's like, we're just not going to accept the world as it is now, because if we accept the world that it is now, it will always be bent back towards keeping the aristocratic order. These tech oligarchs will always be the possessors of the power in this network. And in many ways, there are a lot of people, and myself included, are worried about the systemic consequences of our free and open society. I mean, Zuckerberg went on CNN 2 weeks ago and with a straight face said, yeah, we're just deleting all the accounts of anybody trying to organize protests against the lockdown. It's like, right. I'm sorry, what?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So that actually goes right into the question I was going to ask. So given your 6 principles, we've talked before that people are more likely to, let's say, take action or pay attention at all to issues when they feel like they're being harmed, and if you can define that harm. And I thought, maybe you could talk a little bit about the harm that the status quo does, and we could talk about anything from warrantless searches to the surveillance economy to things that I can't even think of right now. And then I guess the second part of my question, which could be very long and open-ended, is then what are the technical tools that you envision will address these problems? And again, that's a very open-ended and complex answer, I'm sure, but I thought those are good directions to go.
Well, let me take your first one, which was the surveillance and sort of the problems we see. What are the harm? Yeah, what's the harm that's being done? Well, I mean, we saw a week ago that the reauthorization of the Patriot Act, there was supposed to be an amendment, or there's a proposed amendment.
There is an amendment. It's the I forget the name of the senator, but God, I'm like 2 degrees away from him. I can't. Wyden somebody. Yeah, amendment, right? Yeah,
the Wyden amendment, which was to limit searches of people's browsing habits to being under a warrant, right? You have to go and get a warrant to be able to get that information. And I mean, if you think about it, that should be the case, because you have to get a warrant now to see what people check out of the library, which is a very similar kind of search of a person's interests and reading habits. And it was narrowly defeated. It fell by 1 vote, I think. It was.
Oh, really? It's already happened?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, the legislative process is always in churn. You never know what's in it until it's actually been passed and actually gets to the president's desk and they sign it. But the practical here is that they would be able to see where you've been by going to your ISP and just getting the records without a warrant. It would just be warrantless surveillance of all of our web browsing habits. And my point that I made to Katherine in our discussion before this recording was that, we're only worried about this because of the way the web is designed. That if the web had been designed from the beginning to be fully user sovereign and truly decentralized, meaning it was totally encrypted, totally anonymous and private by default, the FBI wouldn't even be bothering, because they would know that what the ISP see is nothing. They see just random bits, flying by, and they don't know where they're going. They only know where they came from. And they can't correlate the responses coming back either. So they could see packets leaving your house, but they wouldn't necessarily know the packets coming back are coming from that service. So they wouldn't even know that, who you were talking to. I mean, think of it as like pervasive Tor network all the time. It's meant to separate you from the counterparty of your conversation. And they wouldn't even care. We wouldn't even care. Nobody would care. It's like, because the ISP then is just a dumb shipper of bits, right? They're just a boat with containers on it, right? Nobody cares.
Nor should we
care. And you wouldn't be able to glean any information other than the fact that I'm on the internet and I am sending data, right?
And I think maybe part of the problem is that because the internet was designed this way, and suddenly this data and surveillance was accessible to whoever wants to access it. It could be, marketing people or, law enforcement or whatever. Well, suddenly,
Right.
They're chomping at the bit to get to it. But really,
Right.
You made an analogy earlier about checking out a library book. Your library history versus your search history. And, I would argue that, your internet activity is far more intimate and personal than any of that. I mean, you're
Right.
talking about, you're talking about all the things we play Dr. Google with. We're talking about our private health anxiety. You're talking about, our most intimate thoughts about anything, and I think that just because we have access to that certainly doesn't mean we should. I don't know. I think we're getting in a really disturbing sort of thought police situation that of course, people like us, we're very aware of it, but I think, many are not, especially, when we're talking about things like pandemics. Suddenly, everyone is desperate for this data just because they think it's there. And and I don't know how you talk the masses out of it other than,
Yes.
Well, I'll let you take it.
This is interesting because I'm never going to be able to talk my mother out of Facebook, and nor should I. She really enjoys Facebook. It gives her a lot of connection to the outside world. What I'm getting at, though, is that as technologists, we have a responsibility that we should not build systems that open up the users of that system to potential civil rights violations, potential, societal impact. There's no doubt that the social media systems are being used to manipulate people's emotions, manipulate their politics. To what end, it's not always obvious. We don't know. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. I mean, it's definitely good to be able to tell everybody, hey, you should probably put a mask on and stay home for a little while. I mean, that's always been a necessary function in society. But the problem is that we can't tell when it's a public service announcement or when it's a paid for political manipulation. When it comes across the social media network, you cannot tell, right? Before it was always that crazy blare on the TV and this is just a test, right? That was, if there was ever a real emergency, this is how it would sound, right? We always knew when it was just the government or, some kind of alert that we all probably needed to know about versus normal advertisement. And when you blur those lines through social media, you really give too much power to the people who have control over that, I think. And so to get back to my original point, we have a responsibility not to build systems like that. That's why these principles of user sovereignty are important. As a technologist, if we're building something new, if we follow these principles, it's my thought that we'll get to something that protects its users from that potential, the consequences. And you can't always anticipate what those consequences will be. I mean, look at with this FBI searching of our browser history, right? Do you think Tim Berners-Lee thought back in 1988, 1990, whenever back then, that, I'm building a system that is going to be a primary investigative tool of federal law enforcement? I guarantee you he didn't think about that. And so, yeah, it's really important. And to the point about my mom talking her out of Facebook, I'm not going to try to do that. And I know that privacy doesn't really sell anything in the market. So the idea is to how do we build these systems that are user sovereign, that are actually better? They have a better user experience. They're actually better and more streamlined and provide a better service. I mean, we have to beat them in the market on services and on features, not on principles. One of the interesting things about these problems of distributed systems is if you solve them using user sovereign design, I actually think that it will actually work like magic. It will be a better service. You have things like automatic discovery and automatic introduction. So getting connected to my friends doesn't require going to a server, right? And looking them up. I can just, through other methods, being able to connect with my friends either through my phone or, a text message, or we're next to each other. And so we fist bump or whatever, right? So Yeah, it really, I think, is on us as technologists. And I think that's why my beef is really with the DWeb people and not with anybody else. Like, I no longer really care about Twitter, Facebook, and Google. I just want to beat them in the market with better features and better technology that's designed with the right philosophies in mind. And because the DWeb people are chasing a fantasy that was never true. I think we should go deeper in the stack when we talk about reinventing things.
Yeah, I was personally pretty. Actually, I haven't thought of them as the DWeb people, but when I look at what Tim Berners-Lee did with Inrupt and Solid, it struck me as, well, it's kind of a better way of doing the stuff we already don't like, right. Rather than, I really wanted Tim to kind of play God and sit back there and say, no, here are the rules. Like, come down with your 6 things or 9 or whatever and say, these are the principles that were embedded in the web in the first place, and all you guys are off base, but that didn't happen. And he decided he was going to get into business kind of somehow. And I don't know where that stands, but it didn't excite me, and it still doesn't.
I personally like him. I've met him a few times.
Yeah.
I think the world has put a bit large burden on his shoulders, and he's just a guy like the rest of us.
Yeah.
I do like what they're trying to attempt. What I was telling Timothy Ruff the other day when I was talking to him was Tim Berners-Lee is just eating one slice of the same pizza we're all eating, right? He's just not looking at the whole pie. With Solid, if you look at it, it's really about an open and standard protocol, right, for storing your data and exposing it to the world. It's strong. It uses strong encryption, so it's to maintain your control over your data, and it's really about a balance of power between users and systems. It's just not the whole thing. It's not private by default necessarily. It's not pseudonymous by default necessarily, because it's still tied to places. It's still tied to domains and things like that. It's not fully portable data in the sense that it could live anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to have a URL that will point to your pod or whatever, right? As I understand it. I could be wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I got a pod, and I put a couple things in it, but it sort of stopped there. I didn't know what was useful about
right.
it,
Right, yeah.
And I think it's one of those things where you kind of need the critical mass. You need the thing in the world that people take one look at and say, I got to have that, right? And it's not, it doesn't have that.
Well, the one way to get these pods to take off. I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
No, what I was going to ask is, so we talk about the DWeb people, chasing a fantasy. And it's just, I'm trying to rack my brain. If they are chasing a fantasy, then how do we collectively solve this problem without, pushing too much, rules and regulations on companies and people today? How do you solve this problem today or, over this next decade so that we aren't chasing a fantasy?
Well, this is actually a pretty interesting line of thinking. That's a great question. Again, what you were talking about is things like GDPR and CCPA, and I was saying that that's like a Magna Carta. This is where I'm going to get pretty purist and pretty fringe radical. So bear with me. I'm trying to use an analogy here. It's not necessarily my personal beliefs, but there are other civil rights where there's a struggle between technological power and legislative power. And I'm specifically talking in America about Second Amendment rights. We've had, in the Constitution, the ability to keep and bear arms. And over the years, there have been a number of legislative attempts to try to moderate that, right? You can still own a machine gun today, but you have to jump through a ton of hoops and whatever, right? But what really truly terrifies legislators is the ability for people to automate the manufacture of weapons in their home. Okay, so 3D printed guns or like desktop milling machines that can just crank out a gun, just boom, push the button, put a piece of aluminum in it, and bang, you get an AR-15, right? It's not that simple. I don't mean to oversimplify it, but it's definitely possible. Okay, and that terrifies the people who have always thought that legislative answers would maintain the normal order. And then suddenly we have this advancement in technology that now disrupts the balance of power in the system, okay? And it's got a lot of people worried. What we have right now in the web is the technological advantage, the technological power rests entirely with the tech oligarchs, right? We don't have the technological tools to balance that power out. I mean, we have Tor, but it's not widely used and doesn't present a better web necessarily. It's actually a slower web and a limited web because they turn off JavaScript and all these things. And so as an answer to trying to balance that out, we, the people, have pushed our legislators to pass these privacy protection laws to try to force a balance in the power between the system and the users, and the oligarchs and the proletariat. But what I'm arguing is that what we need is a sudden shift in the technological power, not the legislative power. So that goes to what you were saying. How do we have a better future without having to make all these crazy rules about how you can talk and do business with you know, on the web or on the internet? And that's where my research and my analysis around these 9 problems of distributed systems and how to solve them using user sovereign design comes into play, because the whole point of it is to fundamentally shift the availability of a radically powerful technological platform for free speech and free association, right? It would be like the equivalent of a 3D printer, a 3D printed gun, you know, gun manufacturing thing, but for free speech, right? We would no longer require something like Facebook, Twitter, or Google, or YouTube, right, to be gatekeepers or moderators of what our discourse is. This philosophy of mine really came about when I worked at the Linden Lab on Second Life, and it was a really eye-opening experience about how their philosophy there and dealing with all of the possibilities of humanity in one space. And yeah, their philosophy at Linden Lab was to provide good filtering, a system for people to filter their experience, but to not have anything on by default. So it was the full unfiltered reality. And then if you didn't want to see certain words or certain avatars or go to certain places, you could turn on restrictions for yourself. It was an inversion of censorship. So did I just
No.
The wood chipper went on outside my window again. So
oh
yeah, I don't know if that's audible or not. But
not audible audio.
Actually, it seems to me, I mean, I think the more palatable comparison might be to the First Amendment in a way, because I think everybody assumes they have free speech, but actually the instruments for it kind of got co-opted. I mean, I saw this happen with blogging, but I mean, blogging and RSS especially, you know, I mean, RSS is a really simple hack that Dave Weiner came up with, and it made it possible for everybody to syndicate what they were doing, and made it real easy for everybody to publish for the world. And we're seeing something like this something perverting that right now happening with podcasting. Like this podcast will go out with RSS. So will most of the ones in the world, but Joe Rogan just did $100 million a pound deal with Spotify. And Spotify says, yeah, he's going to go behind a paywall next fall or early next year. So it won't be a podcast in the open world. It'll be a podcast inside their silo, right? And I suppose we'll still all be free and all that. But I saw something like that happen, like with blogging software. WordPress is a knockoff of movable type to some degree, and it's too complicated. And we never really had this simple, easy way for any one of us to blog. And I don't know whether we absolutely have to have these big systems in order to do a lot of what we need to do. I mean, I'll give Amazon AWS its due. We're using Zoom right now, and I know Zoom has, AWS as a back end that gives it the scale that they need, and it works, but it's more or less, it's kind of like the water system. Yeah, we know it's there, but it doesn't care what's on it. I probably does, but not in a way that concerns me too much. But I think we're missing the key piece that gives anybody the sense that they have real autonomy and sovereignty and power, but doesn't get you into the arguments that are, no, wait a minute, we're actually all social beings too, and in order to be social, we need the big systems. When, yeah, of course we're all social beings too, but we're both personal and we're social, but we manage to create systems over and over again that subordinate the personal, not just to the social, but to the gigantic. You know, we reinvent the feudal system over and over again, saying, I don't know how we get along without castles. You know,
Exactly.
As long as we have castles, we got to have the rule of law in the castles. And then, you know, and as for the GDPR and the CCPA, it's important to note that the GDPR calls us a data subject. That's it. That's what we are. We're a data subject. And a natural person is a data subject, not a data controller or a data processor, which are the actually empowered beings. And the CCPA calls us a consumer. All we do is consume. And it gives us the right to get back what's already been taken, which isn't really enough.
Right. Well, like I said, it's a détente. You know, it's an agreement to preserve the existing system. And what we really need to do is reject it. And considering that any possible legislative effort would also be influenced by the tech oligarchs, like, we can't rely on a legislative solution to really balance the power out on the internet. And what we really need to be doing is this technological shift in power. We need to just reject submitting ourselves to something that can surveil us.
So
That's
let me
where
ask you
these
about
user sovereignty principles come from.
So I mean, you work for Hyperledger. I think there's probably a good chance that a lot of people in our audience don't know what Hyperledger is, or that in fact it's one of the umbrellas within the Linux Foundation, which quietly became, like, from a little thing to something really gigantic.
Yeah. So yeah, I do. Before I go on, I do want to point out that everything I've said here is my own personal opinion,
sure,
not just like reflective of Linux Foundation or Hyperledger. But that said, I absolutely love working in Hyperledger and Linux Foundation. I first installed Linux when someone uploaded Slackware 1.0, all 13 floppies of it, on my 20 megabyte hard drive on my BBS back in the mid 90s. And I was really angry that someone took up that much space on my BBS, and decided to check it out. Saw a message saying, hey, you should install this. So I've been using Linux since, I think 0.99 back in the day. And
that would have been 94.
94, ish. Yeah. And so needless to say, it's been a lifelong dream of mine to work for the Linux Foundation. And still haven't met Linus yet, believe it or not. He does his thing up in Oregon. We don't get together very often. I've never bumped into him at a company thing. But Hyperledger was started a couple years ago, 4 years ago now, to be the home of enterprise blockchain. And that stuff it's not Bitcoin, but it uses the same kinds of principles and technology. It's really about creating consensus amongst lots of parties and maintaining a consistent view of the world as they're concerned of across all the participants. So if you have say a bunch of participants in a market where they're all bidding on futures or whatever, they're all bidding on something, the transaction system is done in such a way that they all check each other's work and they all come to consensus together. So the application in Bitcoin is we all agree that the possessor of this one public key sent Bitcoins to the possessor of this other public key. That's all that Bitcoin really does, is build consensus around that. But enterprise blockchain can be used for basically everything else. It's been really useful for things like supply chain. In fact, Walmart launched something last year. I'm not sure if it's fully in production yet, but to deal with food supply safety. When they had that problem with leafy greens being contaminated, they really wanted to solve this problem, and they used a Hyperledger software to track farm to store and to be able to basically watch where every piece of food went in its process of getting to the shelves. And if there was ever a problem, they would have a record of it. Now, what's interesting about these blockchains is that they use cryptography in such a way to make infallible records of what happened. And why that is most important is that when you start talking about user sovereign design in this new decentralized world that I'm pushing, you have to anchor trust in data. You have to anchor trust somewhere. How do I know that you actually are the possessor of a driver's license in Nevada? Well, there has to be some cryptographic proof that's anchored to some data somewhere. And that data is, you know, the test that I passed to get my driver's license in Nevada and my personal data or whatever, right? So you have to be able to anchor trust. And blockchains are really, really good at proving that data existed, and that data, or that, you know, it existed at a specific time, and that the data has not been changed since then. Or if it has been changed, well, we know exactly when it was changed and how it was changed. And so when you have that provenance, if you will, over data, you can then anchor trust on that data. We can prove things cryptographically about that data. And so I love working there because this fits into my broader philosophy of how the world should be decentralized. And it's a very, very important tool in a world that's getting more and more digital, is to be able to track that data and to know that it hasn't been modified and that we can trust it and that it's been around since they said it was around, right? So yeah, I love working for the Linux Foundation. It is definitely a lifelong dream. Probably one of my favorite jobs I've ever had, actually. Very great, good, nice people.
That's fantastic. So is there anything blockchain is not good for?
It doesn't make coffee.
People are
very well,
using
actually.
it for that you wish they weren't?
It may not make, but it can track where your bean came from.
It's exactly right, right? I mean, blockchains they're actually very narrow in what they do. It's just that narrow thing applies to so many things. I think that's why blockchain kind of got overblown over the last few years. It's like, no, blockchain doesn't do everything. No. Blockchain tracks data. The thing is that everything has data in it now. So if you need to track that data, that's probably a really good solution for that.
I generally think of it as it's a now formerly novel database design. Okay, so
That's correct.
It's an interesting distributed database design, and
Yes.
And there are a number of them. It's not like there's just one, and there are private ones, there are public ones, there are probably way too many to name at this point. One of the things that I like about what's going on with inside Hyperledger, but out in the world, is the notion of self-sovereign identity. And that, which is really very simple. You were going into it before. It's just that all you need to know is that I'm licensed to drive in California. That's all you need to know. You don't need to know anything more than that. And if and if all you need to know is that I'm old enough to to get into the bar or whatever else it is. That generally, when people are asking, or when any system is asking for your ID, what they're looking for is one simple thing. Right. I mean, some is more, when you're and the SSI world calls this a verifiable credential or a verifiable claim. Somebody issued a credential, it could be verified, and the blockchain. I mean, they call them ledgers mostly. Are just storing like a hash of a piece of data. Is that right? Something like that?
Yeah. So they're based around a data structure called a hash-linked data structure, where think of it as like rows in a database, but the database only grows in one direction. So like rows are only ever added, they're never removed. And when you add a new row, not only does it have the new data in the new row, but it has a hash, a digest of the previous row. So they're linked to all the previous data. And the reason that's important is you can't pluck a row out of the middle somewhere without that tampering being evident, right? So think of it as like, some tamper-proof tape on a consumer product. If you try to open it up to take something out, everybody can tell you broke the warranty sticker or whatever, right? So it's just us doing that in software, in data. And the interesting thing about this is that any time you generate data, and I'm going to shoot from the hip here. I was in a conversation like 3 hours ago where I think we invented something. I think so. Actually, I think so. This is very interesting. So anytime you and I create data, so like even when we're creating this podcast, for instance, we can be recording this and then storing it in a hash link data structure where we all have a copy of it. Okay, so maybe it's only one entry, this recording. But if this was over text, it could be each one of our conversation, you know, the text that we send in the conversation could be a record in this hash link data structure. Now, since we all have a copy of it, any one of us can anchor, quote unquote, anchor it in an existing public blockchain. So I could go and move some Bitcoins in the Bitcoin blockchain and store in that transaction the URL where you can download this and the hash of this, right? So we could prove that it existed today, and anything else we want to prove about it, like, you know, that Doc Searls was in it, that Dave Huseby was in it, you know, that the four of us were in this podcast. Okay, we can anchor it, and as long as it's available publicly, I can now then issue verifiable claims against it. And the invention was the universal, I mean this in a philosophical sense, not the brand sense, but a universal oracle, right? Which is something you go to for a source of truth. I'm thinking that there needs to be a universal oracle plus a universal, like a standard format for describing what can be proven from that data. And then anytime you generate data, you just feed it to this server, and it goes, oh, well, data of this shape allows me to issue credentials of these types. So if it were driver's licenses, then it could be credentials that say these people can drive, right? If it's podcasts, it's these people spoke together for this many minutes or whatever, right? There is something here, this idea that any data that's generated on the internet can immediately be anchored and then created as the source of truth for verifiable credentials or verifiable claims doesn't exist, first of all, right now. And I think it should be something that we have, because in a fully user sovereign world, the integration point now is these verifiable credentials. It's not APIs. It's not even protocols necessarily. It's, you know, I want to be able to go to the post or go to a store and buy something and mail it. The integration point is, here's my KYC credential, here's my proof of payment, and here is a voucher to claim a shipping label to mail it to my house, right? Those are 3 credentials, delegated credentials. Anyway, I could hold sermon on this forever, but you know, it's just, when you're talking about self-sovereign identity and these verifiable credentials, I really think in a decentralized world moving forward that is the point of integration. If we're all able to talk and to reason and to make transactions happen based off of these verifiable credentials, these things that we can prove to be true based on some data, then we get away from, you know, the client server master slave model, right? We're now talking about some pervasive fabric in which we can get through transactional processes and reason almost automatically about the things that are true about us.
Right, and I think,
yeah.
I'm sorry, and I think you're getting to the heart of what you were saying earlier about we can't distinguish what's real information, you know, and what's manipulation. And if you have a verifiable record of true information,
that's true. I mean, news is always going to be subjective, and truth is always going to be subjective. I'm talking about objective truth, not subjective truth.
But there are some objective truth in the world.
The height of Mount Everest is still an objective fact.
Yeah.
Right.
Supposedly. Objective and to the point where we can actually have legal and business processes based around some of these objective facts, right? I do have enough money to buy it. That's an objective fact that I can prove, for instance, right?
Yeah.
I guess I won't be able to deny that I was ever on this podcast.
Not if we anchor it and then I start issuing credentials. But yeah, this is it was a really interesting conversation I had earlier, and it was one of those, you know, pardon my language, but it was one of those, oh shit moments where like, that doesn't exist right now. That would be really useful. Yeah, it was a fun conversation.
Now, I have my notepad and pen. What was that idea?
No? Oh no, I'll give you a better one. I'll give you a better one. You want to make $1 billion? The secure scuttlebutt design they like to claim is decentralized, but they left some holes in the design. There's no decentralized solution for discovery, which is I'm a new user, I want to find other users to follow so that I can get their updates. They don't have a decentralized solution for that. They don't have a decentralized solution for now that I'm following somebody and I go offline, turn my phone off, and now I'm back an hour later. How do I reconnect to those users and get their updates? They don't have a decentralized solution for that either. And that's called, that's called coherence, is the name I gave to that. Because they don't have solutions for that, almost every secure scuttlebutt user, when they start getting on it, secure scuttlebutt is an open source, supposed to be a decentralized Twitter-like thing, right? Microblogging thing. Well, because they didn't design solutions for those two things, every user connects to what are called pubs, and those are super users. They're scuttlebutt users that if you follow it, then everybody who follows it can see you. So it helps connect to other users, and it helps build the social network. You want to make $1 billion, make the scuttlehub.com, make the world's greatest discovery and coherence mechanism for secure scuttlebutt. Yeah.
Is that it?
Yes,
that it?
That's it.
Okay,
Yeah, secure scuttlebutt. Yeah. And it's kind of the rage right now in the hacker community and the DWeb community. But it doesn't have fully decentralized solutions for all the problems. So it's open for a Scuttle hub, like a GitHub kind of solution for this community.
Okay.
And especially if you built into it content creator tools, like I can have subscribers. So if you took Patreon and put it in there in this hub, and you put, maybe a storage and distribution mechanism so you could store your files on it or whatever, right? A search mechanism. None of these things are built into the secure scuttlebutt with a decentralized solution for it. So build that, grow secure scuttlebutt, become the biggest fan and promoter of that system until you start making a dent in Twitter's new user uptake numbers, and then sell it for $1 billion to Twitter. I mean, there you go. There's your recipe for becoming a billionaire, a tech oligarch.
So there's a thought for our audience I think where we stand time-wise, Katherine?
It's probably about time to wrap it up. Although, okay. I feel like please come back. I think we have lots of conversation to be had.
I'd love to. I would love to. You guys are wonderful people.
Well, I think so. So Doc and I have had this conversation.
I'm not wonderful at all.
No, Petros is
yes,
awesome.
You are.
Did you
Petros has been. He may not be wonderful, but he is helpful, which may be more important. Yeah. So where do we go to support what you're doing, Dave?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a lot of code that I've published about this, but I've been working with a number of big thinkers, whom I'm not free to name here. But if what I'm saying resonates with your listeners, I'm sure that you can help get them in contact with me. I don't use any social media, not even LinkedIn, because I limit the amount of data I put on the web. I think the only way you can ever solve the AI decision-making problem would be to starve them of your data. So I deliberately put false information about me out there, to throw sand in the gears. And then I don't use any social media, because the internet will absolutely be used as a searchable database of implied intent. And if you happen to have supported an idea that is no longer popular in the future, I mean, we've already seen this when people go back through tweets, from 20 years ago, and then they lose their acting career or their singing career or whatever, because they said something that's no longer acceptable, right? So anyway, if they're really interested in what we're doing about, or what I've been working on in user sovereignty and the 9 problems of distributed systems, and I would love to talk to them. I think from my experience of building open source communities, I think we could have a really good one that is largely nice and benevolent and fun to be a part of. And I think really what the first step to do is to start working on something like a pervasive mixnet. We have to go deep in the stack. Remember, we can't work on the web from the top down. We've got to work on the web from the bottom up. And the first step to that would be to build a truly pervasive mixnet that operates under the assumption that all of the nodes are mobile and frequently disconnected and change their IP addresses. It's a super hard problem that was first identified, I think, by Andrew Tenenbaum back in his distributed systems book. The intro to his book says something to the effect of a fully distributed, ubiquitous storage fabric made up of frequently disconnected and mobile users is left as an exercise to the reader. I read that when I was in college way back in the 90s, and I've been working on it ever since. And I think we're getting really close with mobile IPv6 and the ability to basically be connected all the time without changing your IP address is going to be really a game changer. And I think if we wrote some very key software that just makes this a ubiquitous fabric where everybody's anonymous and everybody, well, pseudonymous and private and encrypted, and then we build on top of that, that would represent, like what I said earlier, the equivalent of a 3D printer for my First Amendment rights. And it might be a serious technological shift in the power structure of the internet. I don't have any illusions to think that this would be anything useful or great, but who knows? I mean,
I think
Tim
it'd be
Berners-Lee
useful and great. If it ubiquitizes, it has to be useful and great. So
right, I hope so. But so many people have tried this before, right? And it hasn't happened. I mean, if it was that easy, then we'd all be using, was it GNUnet or Freenet for publishing online? You know, but then again, it does happen. Tim Berners-Lee didn't think the web would be as big as it is. I mean, he's said that many times.
Yeah.
So who knows? You should never begin a project like this worried about the outcome. You know, all the problems are baked into in the beginning. I mean, the web itself had problems from the very beginning, and really all I care about is that it has the right philosophy and that follows the right principles, and that's what these user sovereignty principles are. Now, whether it's useful or not, I don't know. I would use it. I'm trying to build the internet I'm comfortable using. That's really what it is. I don't, honestly, I don't give a shit about it. Sorry, I shouldn't say that.
I'm going to build the planet that I need, okay? You
Right,
guys can come along if you want. But
in many ways, I don't give a shit about other internet users, but it's about me. But in a way, if I make it, I'm so sensitive to my privacy and you know, my sovereignty on the line, that if I worry about building something that I'm comfortable with, that I use, I'm pretty sure it would also be useful for other people. So at the same time, I do care very, very much about everybody else on the internet.
Well, I think the first step is people that care a lot more about these things, you know, get it going, and then I think as more, you know, more and more people will start to care because, well, it's inevitable. I think there are some very serious problems resulting from the internet as it is, and if no, you know, somebody's got to start somewhere, right?
Right. I just really want to get connected to my buddies and have a very secure and private place for us to have open and honest conversation. That's really what I'm trying to have.
I'm sort of seeing you as the as the choking canary looking for a better coal mine. You know, it's like, and you're going to drill your own coal mine, and by the way, it's not going to be coal. You know, it's going to be whatever ore you like.
Right. I'm partial to actually digital gold, but that doesn't come out of the ground. That's mined by hashing machines. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Dave. This has been fantastic. Anytime. And see you in the interwebs with the post interweb.
That's if you can find him.
I was going to say where.
I think we can.
Well, anyway, thank you so much. We'll have to do it again. Thanks, Petros.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye.